Greetings and welcome to Introduction to Astrology. I'm your host, the Professor. Astrology may have captivated you, may have interested you for several years, and often people look to the newspapers for their horoscopes, and most of the discussion of astrology, the way it is approached in the popular media, does not give justice to how deep the rabbit hole really is with this topic. And so if this seems like a fireside chat, it certainly is. But at the same time, really what it is a deep exploration of what astrology really is, its origins, history, and mystery, as well as its practice in the real world. Now, unbeknownst to most people, there are several kinds of astrology. The first kind that most people are familiar with is known as natal astrology. Natal astrology has to do with birthdays and the psychoanalysis of a chart based on a person's birthday. And in that analysis, there's the date, time, place, all of those sorts of things to give a precise and rich reading regarding the trajectory of a person's life. But this was not the first kind of astrology that was out there. There are other kinds of astrology, and some of them are culturally practiced, and they are based on those differences, those ethnic differences, and some of them are conceptual. For instance, there's such a thing as horary astrology, and horary astrology is used to find usually missing items or ask a question and have that question be answered. The other kind of astrology that's very popular is mundane astrology. Probably the most famous mundane astrologer was Nostradamus. And he was using divine insight, psychic ability, but also astrology to make the predictions that he made. So there are several kinds of astrology, several approaches to astrology, and the cultural differences are important, but the fact is, most of those differences are ethnic in their accent. And I think that you will find that there are more similarities than differences in the kinds of astrology that you're looking at. So to begin this journey, I would like to start in terms of understanding and appreciating the origins, history, and mystery of astrology. Now, if we look to origins, if we go back to the high cultures of the world, and what is a high culture? Is a high culture a culture that accepts cannabis use? I'm joking around. No, a high culture is one in which there are typically farming practices, and based on those farming practices, resulting cultural consequences. A fantastic book by Jared Diamond is Guns, Germs, and Steel. And in this book, he talks about how the farming practices along the Tigris-Euphrates and the Indus Valley in India and also in the Yangtze in China were the sites of massive technological advancement. And one of the consequences of farming practices is you could feed large populations with the grown products, the domesticated animals, which were used for food and also used for other practical purposes. Likewise, superior weaponry was developed, but also, more importantly and more germane to our discussion, was the development of the sciences, mathematics, and physics, and understanding astronomy. Contrary to popular belief, astronomy and astrology are very closely related. And historically, there wasn't very much difference until modern times. Modern times has separated out astrology from astronomy. And historically, that just wasn't the case. So the fact is, astrology and astronomy were very, very close together, and the ancients, we're talking early Sumerian Babylonians, 4500 BCE, these peoples along the Tigris-Euphrates were effectively measuring and accurately measuring the movements of the planets and the stars. And it was discovered that the movements of the planets and the stars took on a predictable character. And that predictable character led to consequences in terms of understanding the cosmos. And this idea of the cosmic order was born. The cosmic order was such an important thing, and this is based wholly and solely on the solstices and the equinoxes. Equinox means equal night, which means the length of the day equals the length of the night, which occurs in the spring and the autumn. The solstice is alternately the longest and shortest days of the year. So we're talking, in the summertime, there's a summer solstice, and then there's a winter solstice. So these observations by the ancient peoples led to the first calendar, an understanding based on the movements of the sun, where the equinoxes and the solstices occurred with great predictable regularity. Likewise, the path of the sun and the moon. We now know that the earth goes around the sun, but the apparent path of the sun in the sky and the path of the moon created something called the ecliptic, or the celestial equator. This is to be imagined like an invisible band around the earth. And this is where all of the planets moved against a fixed background of stars. Planets in the Greek, or planet, the word planet in the Greek means wanderer. And these wanderers would move through the same path that the sun and the moon were taking by and large. And they were seen as independent of the fixed stars and even identified as gods. So the ancient definition of planet includes the sun and the moon because they move and define the shape of the ecliptic, and the planets move on that same imaginary disk. So these movements were measured predictably, and not only were they measured predictably, seasonal festivals were attached to the solstices and equinoxes. Nowadays we see Christmas and Easter during these times of the celebration of the equinoxes and the solstices, because the Christmas occurs during the winter solstice and Easter occurs during the vernal equinox in the spring. So again, none of this is new. It's incredibly ancient, so ancient in fact that astrology has always been there. Every high culture of the world has astrology and has an understanding of astrology, which begs important questions as to our origins. It begs important questions as to, was there some kind of global communication between cultures that we didn't know about? But regardless of the questions that it raises, astrology has been there from the very, very beginning. And not only did it have the mundane purposes that we attach to it, such as when's a good time to plant crops and reap and all of that kind of stuff, it really did have a profound meaning, philosophical meaning to ancient peoples that has descended down into its meaning today to those who really understand its origins and appreciate its origins. So, not to belabor the facts of the situation too much, I want to point out that astrology has always been around. It's been there since the earliest high cultures of the world. And high cultures, we mean farming cultures, not hunter-gatherer cultures. And once those farming practices occurred, then the giant observatories, pyramids, those kinds of things were built. And astrology really started to take hold. Now, the question is, how did it spread out throughout the world? If you look at Sumerian stories, particularly the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, it's been detected in these works of ancient Sumeria that they were very likely these stories that inspired our Bible stories. And even the word Bible has a connection to Babylon or Sumeria. In our understanding nowadays, we have these stories and they're considered sacred stories, but these stories were spread out throughout the high cultures of the world, and frankly were spread throughout Europe and even into the Indus Valley by the Vedic Aryans. Aryan means noble. And how did the Aryans come to be the Aryans? Well, I think it's a plausible possibility that what occurred in Sumeria likely was a flooding. And the flood caused the people to leave the cities that they had there. And it's my contention, and the contention of many other scholars, that the pre-Semitic people, and even the pre-Aryan people, were these Sumerians. But they ended up in different areas. And so the Jews, for instance, became both the Phoenicians, who were seafaring people who ended up inspiring the Greeks, and were also nomadic people, herders of sheep and goats. And also in the great grazing plains in the north, there was a migration. And I would contend that this was a migration northward instead of southward by what would later become the Aryan people. And these people were herders of cattle. Now, this is very, very important in terms of the symbolism, the signs of astrology, and how it got spread throughout this region very likely. So these nomads wandered for a long time. And in the Old Testament, there's all of this story about how the Jews wandered, and they wandered for 40 days and 40 nights. A lot of these stories are about wandering and then finally settling, okay, coming into Canaan and conquering and then settling there. And the same can be said for the Aryans. The Aryans came into Europe, they came into Persia, and they came into India and conquered in those areas. And they brought with them their own mythology and sacred storytelling, and I would argue astrology. So really, if we want to understand astrology and this archaeological history, which has typically been characterized as a very linear history. You know, hunter-gatherers settled down, they started farming. When they started farming, they had a natural push toward technology. And the history books are very likely wrong in this regard. It didn't take on a very linear, perfect path like that. As a matter of fact, it's entirely the case that certainly at some point the hunter-gatherers settled down into cities and developed written language, developed spoken language. But when that was destroyed, they nomadically wandered. And so they were carrying with them an oral tradition for a long, long time. And later that got written down. So it's almost like language develops, and then written language develops, and then it gets destroyed, and then oral language takes over again, and then it gets rewritten later. And so this is really a more accurate depiction of history than the history that's been passed down to us as ancient history in typical academia. So really, honestly, this origin goes far back to the very beginnings, and the migrations of people saw the migrations of this practice of astrology. Now, to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of how astrology came to be and what its real role is very, very important. So the role of astrology and the role of mythology, for that matter, are very, very closely related. Joseph Campbell discusses this at length regarding the archetypes. So does Carl Jung. And thinkers before him, like Bastian, identified what you would call the elementary ideas. And these elementary ideas seem to be superstructures through which we draw upon as human beings. They are primal and foundational. And because we have these elementary ideas or archetypes, we're able to access a deeper level of our unconscious understanding of life. And so astrology is the intersection between the outer world and the inner world. And the inner world is one of the unconscious, in the power and dynamism of the unconscious. And as that's expressed within, it is also mysteriously expressed without. Richard Tarnas writes a wonderful book called Cosmos and Psyche. And in this book, he talks about the problem of personal revelation and experience. That is, the synchronicities, the apparent coincidences that happen in our life that don't seem like they could be the result of chance, are in fact magnified and identified through systems of archetypal understanding. And the most readily available system of archetypal understanding is astrology. And not only is it readily available, it's public. It's not a private experience or a noetic experience, as William James would describe it. So because it's public, because it's something that can be understood by other people, this gives birth to the ability to do a chart reading or the casting of a horoscope, that kind of thing. So now, to understand this intersection between the living of one's life and this archetypal world, we have to understand the bridges that connect those. And most of them can be detected in mythology. For instance, there are 12 signs, there are 12 Olympian gods, there are 12 disciples. And if you go back throughout the sacred stories of the world, the interplay of the gods are always 12. And it's because it's the preservation of the cosmic order. The solstices and equinoxes and the divisions of the seasons, the months based on the movements of the moon. Our word month comes from the word moon. And because of those divisions and the character of the sun moving through those divisions, this gives birth to the signs. And these signs have a signature energy, a character to them. For instance, the sun in Leo is considered powerful and dignified. Well, it's not much of a stretch for the mind to make that the sun is like the lion. You know, it's central, it's powerful, just like the lion is the king of the jungle. The mane of the lion imitates the rays of the sun. It's kingly in its character, as the sun is, masculine and powerful. And Domingo is Sunday, you know, that which dominates. And so when we understand that connection, there's a direct connection between the living of life and what we experience in life and this astrological body. And this connection, which would be called a clang association or crazy by mainstream science, in the esoteric is known as correspondence. And correspondence says, as above, so below, as within, so without. But it also says, alike in mind, alike in kind. So these symbols and symbol systems have an interrelated nature to them. And anthropologists such as Claude Lévi-Strauss and Saussure have detected this in not only ancient cultures but modern cultures, and that this is a fundamental structural understanding of consciousness. So really, when properly introduced and properly understood, astrology really truly has a richness that can be appreciated by those who go deep into the rabbit hole and find these secrets. So I think in our next episode, what we'll be really exploring deeper are these secrets and synchronicities that astrology points to and how they affect our lives as human beings. Thank you so much for tuning in to this YouTube episode. Again, I'm the professor, and if you are enjoying this discussion, you want to continue this discussion, I would encourage you to donate to my YouTube channel. And if you go on to the title of the YouTube channel, you'll see a button there, and that button it says PayPal. You'll be allowed to donate to this channel for further education. Thanks again for tuning in, and so long.